Hello, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly roundup of the main stories on Palestine and the wider region. I'm pleased, as always, to be joined by my regular guest, Moin Robani, to discuss and dissect all the key topics and issues from the past week. Hello, Moin. Thank you for joining us again.
Hello, Nassim. It's always a pleasure.
So there's lots to get through this week. I
Yes.
want to begin, though, with the latest announcement from Israel. We are recording on Sunday the 9th, and before I came on to the office to record the show, I read that Israel is to cut off any remaining electricity supplies to Gaza and that it has intensified strikes on the besieged enclave. Which raises the question as to whether Israel has any desire to enter into the second phase of the ceasefire deal, which is really where I want to begin our show this week. Throughout the week, there were reports of US holding secret talks with Hamas. There were four meetings, I think, that took place with Hamas. Um, the Trump administration spoke to Hamas directly. So let's get your thoughts on that first. What do you think is going on? Of course, Israel cannot be pleased with the fact that the Trump administration seems to be going over or appear to go over the head of Benjamin Netanyahu. So what do you think is happening here? Why are they going over the head of Netanyahu, and what's the aim here?
Well, I mean, this is a development that would have been inconceivable under the Biden administration. The Biden administration wouldn't even actively push for a ceasefire in exchange of captives. By contrast, the Trump administration has both compelled Israel to accept the January agreement on ceasefire in exchange of captives. And what appears to be happening is that the Trump administration has prioritized the release of the remaining captives and corpses in the Gaza Strip belonging to American citizens. So rather than necessarily seeking a comprehensive agreement, it wants to focus more specifically on Americans in the Gaza Strip. And it appears to have concluded that given the Israeli government's recalcitrance to move forward with the agreement, to even commence negotiations on the second stage of an agreement, that it was left with no choice but to speak directly with Hamas, which it did through not its Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, but rather its hostage envoy, Adam Bueller, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And today in the Sunday news shows in the US, in one of his interviews, he said, "We're the United States. We're not an agent of Israel." Again, a statement that would have been inconceivable during the Biden years. And one can imagine now that Israel and its apologists are experiencing a meltdown which rivals that of last week when the movie No Other Land received an Oscar at the Academy Awards ceremony. Quite clearly, the Americans have decided that Israel is an obstacle, and that in order to surmount this obstacle, they need to speak directly to the Palestinians. So it's a very significant major development. The question now becomes what's going to come out. I should add, Bueller even described his Hamas counterparts as people like you and me and nice guys. So you can imagine what's going on in Israel at the moment. But the question now becomes, what next? You know, if in these talks the United States simply makes demands, you know, you do what we want by high noon or else, it's going to end very badly. If, by contrast, Hamas succeeds in persuading the Americans that in order to achieve what Washington wants, Washington will have to use its leverage with Israel to ensure the implementation of what has already been agreed upon, rather than seeking to rewrite and revise that agreement, then things could take a very positive turn. What does appear to be clear at this point is that the talks are very focused on the narrow topic of U.S. Dual national captives and the implementation of the January agreement, and appear not to be discussing, let's say, the broader political issues at the root of all this. But given this opening, it's possible that at a future point that could be on the agenda as well.
And picking up on your last point, I think there is appetite in the US at the moment for Trump to sell his position and say, I am bringing back American Israeli hostages. My priority is America first, and I want to bring them back. And I think that could be a winner for his base and many Americans. And when I heard this story, what I started to think is there is a path for Trump to to get his hands on a Nobel Prize if he wanted to. And in this case, I think it's actually easier than in Ukraine in the sense that all he has to do is the Arabs will pay for the rebuilding of Gaza. The Arabs could also provide security, the Arab countries. All Trump needs to do is make sure Israel ends its occupation, Israel allows for the creation of the Palestinian state, and and offer some kind of a security buffer to the Israelis, and the Arabs are all willing to offer that as well. That seems to be a much easier prospect. And if Trump recognizes this, I think there's a much easier path for him to get his hands on the Nobel Peace Prize by achieving this peace in the Middle East than it is in Ukraine. I mean, I'm just speculating, of course, but those are thoughts that came to my mind. If there is a serious American president, and Trump seems to be more serious on this than Biden ever was, then why not? The possibilities are way bigger than it was during the time of President Biden. He seems to be offering something.
Well, I fully agree. I mean, the difference between Ukraine and Gaza is that while the United States is now seeking to engage much more intensively with the Russians, at the end of the day, the United States does not really, doesn't control Russian decision making. Whereas if you look at the Middle East, the main obstacle is getting Israel to implement what not only Israel has already agreed to, but what the Palestinians have already agreed to. So it doesn't require the production of an agreement that already exists. And with Israel being the main obstacle, well, as we've learned, and of course we already knew, Israel is fully dependent on the United States, militarily, politically, diplomatically. And, as many people have been saying since October of 2023, if the United States wants Israel to behave in a certain fashion, it literally requires no more than a phone call. And so, having said that, there are also now reports that the United States may seek to compensate Israel by permitting it, for example, to annex territory in the West Bank. And dealing with such an unpredictable and erratic American leadership, I wouldn't venture to bet on any outcome. But your premise, I think, is entirely correct. If the U.S. wants to do either a narrowly focused or grand bargain in the Middle East, it's not going to encounter significant obstacles, given that it's something the Palestinians want, given it's something the Arabs will support, and given that it's something Israel can easily be ordered to do. The stars are aligned much more favorably than they are in Ukraine.
And as many have realized, I mean, the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu isn't as rosy as it's presented to the media and the wider world. And I think that would be more the case now that there are rifts between Shin Bet and Benjamin Netanyahu. There was a report that came out last week which concluded that Netanyahu's policies helped pave the way for the 7 October attack. So that's another massive indictment on Benjamin Netanyahu. And one of the things they point out is the fact that Netanyahu's policy of allowing funds to flow to Hamas through Qatar. So they cited a number of reasons why they conclude that Netanyahu's policies actually helped, pave the way for 7 October. What did you make of that? And I'm sure that's also playing into Trump's mind that Netanyahu really cannot be trusted. There isn't much favor for Netanyahu in Israel itself. Of course, they support the genocide. They support his campaign on Gaza, but generally, the love affair between Netanyahu and Washington that was there for many, many years seems to be waning.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that Trump certainly does not have the passionate ideological attachment to Israel that Biden or to varying extents other predecessors as US president had. Trump, at the end of the day, doesn't care for Israel, certainly doesn't care for the Palestinians, doesn't particularly care for the Arabs or other states in the Middle East either. He's looking at it purely from the vantage point of maximizing U.S. interests, which is a very welcome development given the trajectory of U.S. Middle East policy in recent decades, certainly on this issue. And so, the problem is that with most states, there tends to be a relationship between what leadership says and what leadership does. With this particular crew in the White House, there's much less of a connection, and one really has to focus on what they're doing and consider what they're saying either as signals of what is about to come or as camouflage to justify what they're doing, which may well be the exact opposite. So, for example, last week we had this statement by Trump basically making a genocidal threat against the people of Gaza. If you don't immediately and unconditionally release all the hostages, you will be dead. And then, that same day or the next day, we find out, well, the Trump administration is negotiating directly with Hamas. Now, regarding this Mossad report that you've mentioned, it's one of a series of investigative reports in which, in typical fashion, Israeli agencies and institutions are investigating themselves because they don't really accept being investigated by anyone else. Looking at what is being described as the greatest military failure in Israeli history, namely the Palestinian attacks of October 2023. And what the Mossad report concludes, I think correctly, even if it is very self-serving, is that putting together or any explanation of Israel's failure in October of that year is incomplete unless it takes into account the policies pursued by the Israeli government, and that was promoting Palestinian fragmentation as a strategic priority, which meant that Israel, despite its distaste for Hamas, was more comfortable finding ways to assist Hamas to maintain its rule over the Gaza Strip, among others by enabling and even soliciting Qatari financial support to the Gaza Strip so that it, didn't descend into interminable crisis. And it also identified the Israeli government allowing growing incursions into the Haram al-Sharif in recent years, and of course the exponential increase in settler violence in the West Bank. And it basically said, that all these factors together helped produce the October 7th attacks. And those, of course, were marked by a really extraordinary Israeli military and intelligence failure, during which the Israeli military, as we now know, collapsed like a house of cards at the first sign of challenge.
Yeah, let's turn our attention to the main one of the main developments in the region last week, which is a proposal put forward by the Arab countries, led by Egypt, of a 53 billion alternative to Trump's, the Gaza Riviera plan, which will require the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their own country. Um, One of the key features of that is that there is a parallel political track which requires the creation of a Palestinian state. It doesn't make any sense to invest all that money if Israel is going to simply, in a few years' time, destroy Gaza once again, and there is no pathway to Palestinian statehood. So, given that's the case, um, how much hope do you have of this becoming the plan? Now, the Europeans have backed it. Of course, the region has backed it. Many, I think, Germany, France, UK, they've also backed it. So, how much hope do you have that this plan will become the post-war Gaza plan?
Well, when has a plan produced by the Arab League ever seen the light of day? And I suspect at the end of the day, this one will be no different, because if the Arab states were serious about implementing their own vision for the future of the Gaza Strip, or for Palestine for that matter, the first thing that they would have done would have been to ensure the delivery of urgently needed humanitarian supplies to the Gaza Strip, whether Israel approves of it or not, rather than continuing to act as supplicants and waiting for Israeli consent for every drop of water and every grain of rice that enters the Gaza Strip. And until the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip is addressed properly and resolved, Israel and its backers will continue to be able to present the question of Palestine essentially as a humanitarian issue rather than a political crisis. And so the first order of priority must be to ensure normal trade, to ensure delivery of supplies, to ensure that UNRWA retains its role in the Gaza Strip. And secondly, of course, what the Arab states should be doing is exercising pressure on all Palestinian actors, Fatah, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, and the rest of them, to unify and to put forward a unified vision for the future, so that any decision that is made about war or peace or anything else is a collective rather than a unilateral decision. And so, the fact that the Arab states have now individually and collectively and very publicly and explicitly rejected the Trump proposal, the so-called Gaza Riviera proposal, that's a positive development, and it confirms once more that this initiative is stillborn and dead in the water and won't be going anywhere. But to ensure that Arab and Palestinian priorities, rather than Israeli ones, and American ambitions rule the day moving forward, they're going to have to be much more proactive than they were at this Cairo summit, particularly in not accepting Israeli diktats about how the border between Egypt and Palestine is managed.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the plan to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from the Gaza Strip is dead in the water. But the Trump administration seems to be repeating that over and over again. Steve Witkoff mentioned it again during an interview last week. So it's not completely off the table as far as Trump is concerned. And this just yesterday or today, I think there was an article in the Jerusalem Post of an Israeli security head. I've forgotten his name. He came out and he said that we should double down on the voluntary transfer plan, which voluntary transfer, ethnic, the Riviera plan. And his argument is basically that if we push the idea of providing a safe haven for the Palestinians, then we undermine Hamas. And even if Israelis go into Gaza second time or third time, in helping Palestinians, the assumption, of course, is that thousands of Palestinians would want to leave Gaza and go to, in their mind, Qatar or one of the other countries. The assumption being that thousands of Palestinians would seek to leave Gaza and Israel will aid them in this humanitarian initiative and thereby undermine Hamas as a legitimate force, and they can pose themselves as being this humanitarian actor. And this is the kind of ideas that's within Israeli security officials. So yes, to the Arab countries, to many of us, this is dead in the water. It has no hope. But Trump seems to be insisting on this, his officials, and now the Israelis are thinking how they can double down on this and push even further. So it seems like we're in a bit of a muddle here. Which way is this going to go at the moment? If unless the Arab countries use some of their leverage, and they have many leverage, and they could simply say, okay, Camp David, we will think about Camp David and many other normalization deals that are they haven't agreed.
Mm.
They could use many leverages if they wanted to. So they have to show something.
Yes, they could, because this is all about costs and benefits and about raising the costs to Israel and potentially to its Western backers of their policies, and ensuring that the costs exceed the benefits and thereby forcing a change in policy. But I think you've hit the nail on the head, because the real danger of this Trump proposal is not, that the American military is going to deploy to the Gaza Strip and collectively expel the Palestinians to the Sinai Desert or throw them into the sea, and then construct a Trump golf course and luxury hotels in the Gaza Strip. The real danger of this proposal is that it was received with collective ecstasy by the Israeli political class and is being constantly discussed in the Israeli media and so on, and has now become a legitimate, quote unquote, part of the policy debate in Israel, and that it seeks to transform the Palestine question once again into a humanitarian issue to be addressed and resolved through, housing and jobs and social services, rather than the political one that needs to be addressed with remedies like self-determination, decolonization, and statehood. Look, there was a 48 Nakba, and then there was also a mass displacement in June of 1967. With with those two very significant exceptions put to the side, Israel's demographic engineering has generally been gradual. It has been most effective when it seeks to create conditions for the gradual emigration of Palestinians and then preventing them from returning. And so, what this article that you mentioned describes, I think, very clearly, is taking advantage of Trump's proposal of putting ethnic cleansing on the agenda, and allowing Israel to pursue policies that would encourage Palestinians to leave and subsequently ensure that they do not return. But I think, given the glee with which the permanent expulsion of Palestinians is being discussed in Israel and among its apologists and supporters around the world, I think Palestinians are very, very highly attuned to this threat, and obtaining their cooperation, if I can put it that way, is not going to be easy.
Yeah, so the Israeli official cited in the article is Amit Yagur. He's the deputy head of the Palestinian arena in the IDF Planning Directorate. So he's the one who said we need to double down on Trump's plan, use that as an opportunity to advance the Riviera, I think, cleansing plan. Let's turn to, I want to fit three stories into one, which is all related to the way AI is being used to first crack down on Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and also in the US, where there seems to be an architecture being devised to, of course, crack down on Palestinians and activists here in the West. So in Israel, they've devised this AI-driven surveillance system modeled after ChatGPT to analyze, intercept Palestinian communications. So they basically are snooping on all the Palestinians and their communications in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and they're developing this AI system, which again is the way they're doing it is illegal under international law because you cannot spy on every single civilian. That shouldn't be
Yeah, you
permitted.
can.
Yeah, you can. Well, okay, I'll give me a response afterwards. But also connected to that is an AI system which Marco Rubio has spoken about, using AI to track down pro-Palestinian activists in the US and identify activists and then throw them out and kick them out of the US. And Trump also, of course, has come down hard, saying that illegal protests in the US will no longer be permitted. I don't even know what that means. What is illegal protest? But there is a climate that's being created and deploying AI in a way which we've not seen before. Of course, AI being used in the West Bank and Gaza Strip against Palestinians, we know Palestine is a laboratory, as many would say, for the development of some of the enhanced weapons, and in this case, AI. But we're also seeing how this is being used to undermine Americans of rights that are guaranteed in their own constitution. So there is a huge apparatus that is being developed as we speak.
Yeah, I mean it's quite extraordinary, who said technology is by definition emancipatory. It can of course cut both ways, and in the Israeli case, as we've learned repeatedly during the past year, in significant part due to the outstanding reporting of Yuval Abraham, who wrote for Plus 972 magazine and was also one of the co-directors of the Oscar-winning movie No Other Land. Israel has put this technology to extraordinarily nefarious purposes, to genocidal purposes, one can say. And now it's being taken up a level where it's kind of vacuuming every snippet of information, every communication among Palestinians, and then using this in order to identify critics and so on, dissent. It's really it's a absolutely Orwellian hellscape that we're now confronted with. And as you mentioned, what's happening now in the United States is something similar, where social media and interactions are being used in order to identify critics of Israel in order to punish them. And of course, it's the pro-Palestinian activists who are being singled out, whether, not illegal activists, not violent activists, pro-Palestinian activists, whether, irrespective of how they're conducting themselves. Pro-Israeli activists, including violent thugs, those are apparently not on the radar. And today we have this extraordinary um, uh, example of Mohammed Khalil, one of the leaders of what had been a peaceful campaign at Columbia University, being arrested by the FBI. They arrested him and informed him his visa was being revoked. Then he indicated that, in fact, he is a U.S. permanent resident. And they said, well, your residency rights are being revoked. And then when his lawyer contacted the agents and asked to see a copy of the warrant on the basis of which they were arresting him, the agents hung up. So we're clearly getting into new territory that is not only reminiscent of, let's say, the McCarthyist era, in which people are going to be explicitly punished on the grounds of their political beliefs. But I believe we're heading into an era that takes us to an entirely new level and exceeds that. And of course, as we've seen so often, Palestine is seen by governments as the weakest link. In other words, it's a battering ram with which you can destroy established rights and protections. And once you've successfully done so, then with the precedent having been established, then you can move on to arenas where there might be more popular resistance, but the law has already been changed. So then you can begin to take on, climate activists, women's rights activists, labor activists, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and what's interesting observing this situation is how Americans are asking questions about why is this the case? Why are some people not allowed to protest? Why is Trump privileging Israel over others? They're asking these questions. And last week there was a discussion on the biggest podcast in the world, in Joe Rogan. He interviewed someone called Carol, and it's actually driving the pro-Israeli groups mad. ADL and everyone have commented on this because it's been viewed by millions and millions of people. And the discussion is basically how Israel has huge say over the US government, why that's the case, and they're having this discussion. And the discussion also includes Epstein's role. What is Epstein's role in blackmailing American presidents? So they're having this discussion openly on the biggest platform in the world, podcast platform, the same platform Trump went and spoke at, and Joe Rogan became something of a darling of the American right and the Republicans, but now his very platform is being used to push the idea that Israel has too much influence on the US, and it's actually driving the ADL and other pro-Israelis mad. And they don't know what to do about this. So it's opened a Pandora's box, which we don't know which direction it's going to go. And I've been observing this, and I don't think you can turn this around at the moment. There's too many Americans asking the questions which many others were asking. Why does Israel have so much sway in America, where it always gets privileged status on many issues, whether it be universities, protection from activists holding Israel to account. So I think it's yeah. I just want to get your thoughts on that. I mean,
Well,
this is a huge threat in some ways to Israel and Zionism. The fact that Americans are asking serious questions. These aren't pro-Palestinians. These are genuine libertarians, Republicans who support and love their country and want to defend the Constitution. And they believe that the Constitution is being trashed to preserve and protect Israel. And that's a huge dilemma for them.
yeah. This Joe Rogan and Ian Carroll, I don't really
That's
know
it.
much about them. They seem to be a little, off the deep end on the very far right, as far as I know. But I don't know much about them. But I think
No, you're right. But the point is, they're having this discussion, and
yes.
it's
Well,
stirred so much in the US. Yeah, it
That
caused an
that's
issue.
that's what's so interesting. I mean, what's extraordinary about the United States is that it's legitimate to be bitterly critical of the United States. You could even call for the destruction of the United States without consequence. But God forbid you criticize Israel. That's when you experience real problems. And so I think a lot of, these MAGA types, these America Firsters, they want they believe, that criticism of their own country should have a greater cost to it than criticism of some foreign proxy. And also, I think, the Israel brand is losing its allure in the United States at a record pace. I mean, when you begin to have these right-wing types raising questions about Israel, even if it comes laced with conspiracy theories about Epstein and 9/11 and all the rest of it.
Mm.
But these people have been stalwart supporters of Israel and kind of stalwart opponents of Palestinians and Palestinian rights for a long time. And when they begin to raise these questions, particularly given their cult-like following among sections of the American right, I think that's a very significant development. I don't know if you'd plan to discuss this most recent Gallup poll as well.
I will do later on. Yeah, we will do. But,
Yeah,
let's discuss it now. I mean,
yeah. Well, it's extraordinary. I mean, it's Israel's purchase among Americans is at an all-time low. And of course, you can point to Israeli Hasbara being increasingly ineffective of kind of preaching to the choir and trying to convince itself that nothing that Israel is doing is actually real and that all Palestinian suffering is fake and that, there is no genocide, there is no occupation, there is no starvation, there is no baby killing, there is no this, that, and the other. So yes, Israeli Israeli propaganda has, compared to previous eras, been extraordinarily ineffective. I mean, if you look at the types of individuals they're forced to rely on, um, uh, you know, college students who were kind of serial fabulists, fake personalities, and India pretending to be Israeli military veterans and all the rest of it. So those criticisms, I think, of Israel's increasingly incompetent propaganda efforts are justified, but ultimately, it's not about the messenger. People don't like to see dead babies on their screen day after day after day after week after month after year, and it's essentially, it's very difficult to sell genocide. Sure, it may sell very well in Israel, but even in the United States, with its traditional public support in Israel and of Israel, it just doesn't work anymore. Particularly where information is no longer controlled, by the major networks who can filter what people can and can't, learn about what is happening in the Middle East. So this is a very, very serious crisis for Israel because unlike a country, like Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Egypt or whatever. For Israel, public opinion is a strategic asset. Israel has always identified bipartisan public support as of absolutely strategic significance. That's already gone. I mean, if you look at the difference between Democrats and Republicans, Israel has lost the Democratic base. Sure, it still has a Democratic leadership.
Democrats in particular. So if I can just
Excuse
share
me?
some of the stats, Democrats in particular, if I
Yes.
could just share some of the stats from the Gallup poll from last week, it showed that 59% of Democrats support Palestine and only 21% support Israel. And overall in the US, the stats show more something like 20-year decline in support for
Mm.
Israel,
Yeah, and
which is
and
the
if I
highest.
may, I believe that's the first time that Democratic support for Palestine exceeds 50%.
Yes, I think 3 years ago, 2002, where it was more or less even. When I checked the last poll, and it was more or less even around 2002. And now, of course, Israel support for Israel has collapsed. And it's what's interesting also is the fact that this comes on the back of a poll in January, which showed that the majority of Biden supporters who did not turn up to vote for Harris is partly was because of Gaza. The number one reason was because of Gaza, and just 2 days ago, Michael Waltz, who was Kamala Harris's running mate, he
Mhm.
came out and said that the Democrats played it too safe and they should have engaged more with grassroots voters. So there is soul searching now. There are questions being asked, and I think if Democrats are smart, they'll realize that the reason they've lost this election is because really the Gaza war, they did not engage with the mood of the American Democrats. Forget the Republicans. Many of them, of course, there's no way of convincing them that Israel is a failed project or Israel is committing genocide. They're beyond the pale. But their own base, the
Mm.
sentiment within their own base was very pro-Palestinian. And one of the key reason they lost is because of, and I think they're realizing that themselves now. And the polls are beginning to show this.
Yes, and I think, the problem for the Harris campaign was that its brilliant consultants came to, or held the belief that the only people who really cared about this issue were Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, and they're of course a small minority, and that the winning strategy would therefore be to make a very public show of contempt for Palestine as part of their election strategy and to make sure that their donors remained abroad. Well, that backfired rather spectacularly, didn't it?
Mm, yeah, definitely did. And talking about Rubio, I wanted to get your thoughts on really um, it's an incredible image of the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio wearing a cross on his forehead on Ash Wednesday and reaffirming Donald Trump's positions, issuing last warning to Palestinians and saying that they'll have hell to pay if they don't release the hostages. So here you have the image of a person wearing a cross, issuing, threatening violence. And I think the symbol of what that means to the Arab and the Muslim world, of an American president, American official, senior official, wearing a cross, issuing threats like that. I think that's just lost on Rubio, and it's quite a remarkable image that I thought. I mean, what did you think of that?
Yeah, well, of course, violence is an exclusively Muslim problem. Let's not forget that, right? So,
Mm,
um, but I almost feel sympathy for Rubio because formally he's a Secretary of State, but in practice he's really an ornament, kind of a trophy in Trump's trophy closet to as a public demonstration of his total domination of the party, including its neocon wing, of which Rubio has, of course, been a prominent member. And just recently, Rubio was known as one of the Republican Party's strong supporters of continued U.S. military aid to Ukraine. But in the aftermath of Trump's confrontation with the Ukrainian president Zelensky, uh, Rubio has now completely changed his tune, absolutely, liquid spine. And so, Rubio, yeah, can make statements and pretend that he has a role in the policy process. He's a Secretary of State. But, in all our discussions about the Middle East, has Rubio featured even once? The names we've been talking about today are Witkoff, Bueller, Trump, and that's been the case since January. So, Rubio has his little sandbox that he's allowed to play in, but I really don't see him. Uh, I really don't see him exercising kind of the responsibilities of what would normally be considered a Secretary of State anytime soon.
Before we move to some of the other key issues, I wanted to get your thoughts on the last week. There was supposed to be a conference in Switzerland, in Geneva, and that the conference was cancelled, and the reason given for the cancellation is apparently because the agreeing parties of the Geneva Conventions could not agree um, to something. So the backstory is basically the fact that on Friday, last September, I think, the UN issued a resolution declaring Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip illegal, and said that the contracting parties of the Geneva Convention will convene for a meeting on 7th of March to discuss how this resolution will be implemented. And it turns out on the last minute, Switzerland bolt and cancelled this
Mm.
very important meeting to discuss how to move forward with enforcing what was a almost unanimous UN resolution. I think something like 124 countries voted on the resolution declaring Israel's occupation as being illegal. You tweeted about it. So what's the main reason you think that Switzerland has caved, if that is the right word,
That is very
and
much
not.
the right word. Mm.
Okay, so let's hear your thoughts on that.
Well, back in the days when Switzerland was a neutral state, it was appointed essentially as a custodian of the Geneva Conventions, as kind of the caretaker of these documents. And what happened is, that, as you pointed out, the international community, acting through a very clear majority of votes at the UN General Assembly, requested that Switzerland, in its capacity as a custodian of the Geneva Conventions, convene a meeting of what are known as the high contracting parties. In other words, the states that have ratified the Geneva Conventions to discuss this issue about the implications of the International Court of Justice's July ruling of last year declaring Israel's continued occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and of the Gaza Strip as illegal and illegitimate and unlawful, and as something that needs to be brought to an end as rapidly as possible. And what happened is that, as you know, Switzerland at the last minute canceled this meeting that it was basically under an obligation to convene. And the reason it gave is that there is no consensus among the high contracting parties about convening this meeting. Well, whether there is or isn't a consensus from Switzerland's perspective is entirely irrelevant because Switzerland was under an obligation to act pursuant to the General Assembly resolution that passed with a very large majority. So then the question becomes, why is Switzerland now claiming that it can't convene this meeting unless it has the prior support to do so by those parties which appear to be devoted to ripping the Geneva Conventions to shreds and ensuring that they become irrelevant documents? Well, the reason appears to be that it's not only Israel that has worked itself into a hysterical frenzy about this meeting, but also that the United States is very strongly opposed to this meeting, in line with its principled opposition to international law and the role of international legal institutions. And the Swiss appear to either have been threatened with tariffs by the Trump administration or appear to have come to the conclusion that if they went ahead with this meeting, that tariffs on Swiss goods could be one of the consequences. And so their spine very quickly folded, and essentially they caved in and canceled this meeting.
So
It's absolutely shameless behavior,
yes, so,
I
so
should
is
say.
this cancellation permanent? I mean, so if the UN has demanded a meeting for the next phase of how to move forward with having declared Israel's occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank illegal. Obviously, this meeting has to take place someday, so it cannot be off the table entirely. And I just think when I look at situations like this, the Europeans, including Switzerland, on the one hand, they condemned Trump for undermining the so-called rules-based system, that he's the biggest threat. And then on the other hand, they
They
go
do
and
the
do
dirty
some
work themselves.
they do something like this. So it's a really odd place they found themselves in, where they're trashing the whole system
Mm.
just to make sure Israel maintains its continuous occupation. So it's a rather bizarre position. So going back to the
Well,
original question, is this the end of this meeting? I mean,
yeah, well, what could be more European than trashing a system while insisting on its preservation? I mean, it's classic. But in response to your question, I don't really know. I don't know if um, uh, if a situation in which the custodian of the Geneva Conventions, which at the time was a neutral state, if its refusal to fulfill its mandate, if its refusal to fulfill its obligations was envisaged, and if so, what alternative mechanisms might be in place to ensure that this meeting does go ahead. I suspect there is going to be a reaction against Switzerland's shameless dereliction of duty and its complete abandonment of its obligation of neutrality and impartiality in this matter. But what formal mechanisms exist in this respect, I'm afraid I don't know.
I'm just going to put two other stories from the past week, and you can comment on either or both if you want. The first is the appointment of the Japanese judge, Chief Yuji Iwasawa, who will serve until February 2027. So he will complete Nawaf Salam's term. I'm assuming this is significant because the person who many feared would take over was Julia Sabutinde, who's probably the only judge who voted against the ICJ ruling over a year ago. And the other is this took me by surprise and many others. Qatar demanding Israel give up its nukes and place it under the safeguard of the International Atomic Agency. I mean, what do you think has made Qatar do this or make this request to the IAEA, sorry.
IAEA, yeah.
IAEA, sorry, yeah.
No, is it? Yeah. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I was very pleasantly surprised by the development at the International Court of Justice because, as you point out, the court's president, the Lebanese judge, Nawaf Salam, recently left the court in order to take up his the position of Prime Minister of Lebanon, to which he had been appointed by its new president, Joseph Aoun. And that made Julia Sebutinde of Uganda the acting president. And the question that everyone was asking was whether she would remain president until the end of the term for which Nawaf Salam had been elected, which is still a number of years, or whether the court would hold the judges would hold a new vote to elect a president once a new judge to replace Salam had joined the court. And I think once again, to many people's pleasant surprise, the remaining judges did not even wait for Salam to be replaced by a new judge. That individual has yet to be elected, and instead convened and selected their Japanese colleague to fulfill the function of president of the court until the end of Nawaf Salam's term. And I think this is very clearly a rebuke of Sebutinde. I think it shows that the court felt kind of embarrassed by having such an unserious ideologue who basically says that legal disputes are irrelevant when it comes to Palestine. As the president of the court, it doesn't having her as a president doesn't exactly project seriousness of purpose and gravitas and credibility without which the court can't retain its stature. So she continues, of course, as vice president of the court, but the court is no longer besmirched by having her as a president. And again, the surprise is that they didn't even wait for the election of a new judge to replace Saddam. They seem to be in a hurry to remove her from the acting presidency of their institution. Regarding Qatar,
Before you go to
yes,
Qatar, I think what probably swayed their decision also is that there was an online campaign showing how Subitinde was basically plagiarizing many of her decisions and judgments, exposed by people like your friend Norman Finkelstein and many others. And I think that there must be a general aversion to having someone, the ICJ chief, having such a spotlight and so much attention in social media. So I think that probably also made them think, is she really suitable to
yes.
have such a high position, given that there is constant focus on her and allegations of her plagiarism and things like that. So sorry,
Well,
I
if
just
I
wanted to
if I
continue.
could just respond to that, since you mentioned Norman Finkelstein, in his new book, he actually not only demonstrates that I think something like 30% of her dissenting opinion in the advisory opinion on the illegality of the occupation is plagiarized. I think more importantly, he demonstrates that her constantly shifting views in the genocide case demonstrate very clearly that every one of her positions appeared to be tailor-made to suit Israel's agenda. And he concludes that that's the case because it was tailored for her by Israel rather than by herself. And, somewhere all these accusations began to gain traction, and the court clearly decided that its own credibility was very much in the balance, and that they had to marginalize her in order to be able to proceed.
Yeah, and on Qatar, you're going to say something, and I interjected. I interrupted
Well,
you.
yeah, no, on Qatar, my suspicion is that it reflects a growing concern among the Gulf states, and not only Qatar, about the potential consequences of an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. We recently also had a statement, I believe also by the Qataris, that such an attack would contaminate the water supply up, up, upon which the Gulf states rely for desalination. And, given that they don't have rivers or much rainfall, desalination of seawater is their primary source of water. And I think this is also the Qataris, I think, along with the Russians, have also been playing a role in trying to mediate between the Americans and the Iranians. So I think this could, given that in addition to sending a letter to the Iranian leadership and expressing an interest in negotiations with the Iranians, given that in addition to doing that, the Americans and Trump has also been making kind of threats, and given that the Iranians feel that the Americans have gone out of their way to prove themselves unreliable and untrustworthy, given that Trump in 2018 unilaterally withdrew from the nuclear agreement, and that Biden refused to rejoin it unless it was fundamentally rewritten. I think this could also be an effort by the Qataris to show that Iran is not being held to a different standard than a state that, in contrast to Iran, has even refused to have any supervision of its, in this case, military nuclear stockpile. And of course, the Israelis have reacted with outrage that somehow, they're once again being victimized and singled out. And the interesting thing is now they're openly, Israel flunkies are now openly referring to Qatar as an enemy and trying to present it as an American enemy, conveniently overlooking that the largest Israel American military base in the Middle East is in fact located in Qatar. So you know, I don't think it's going to get very far. But for Israel, even the idea of having its nuclear arsenal mentioned in public is, of course, an unforgivable outrage.
And talking about Qatar, it was the Qatari foreign minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman bin Jassim, who, in a recent interview, again with Tucker Carlson,
Yeah, another
this
right-wing
time
icon.
another right winger. But the interview was received really well in America because his followers are right wing again. I think this interview presented Israel as being an unstable entity in the region. And looking at the reviews and the comments, I think they were very understanding of the Qatari position, and it went down really, really well.
Mm,
And one of the lines from that interview was that, mentioned by the Qatari Foreign Ministry is that peace has many enemies. And he mentioned that in response to a question about Qatar's role in the region. And that line stuck with me. Peace has many enemies, and I think I want to use that in the context of Syria, where
mm,
this is our final question, where we are seeing horrific violence over the past couple of days. Something like 1,000 people were killed in the coastal region, and a lot of it is in clashes between the interim government and Assad forces sympathetic to Bashar al-Assad. And this is all happening while al-Shara, Ahmad al-Shara, who is the president of Syria, he is seeking to draft a new constitution. And today he's issued a statement saying that anyone found guilty of shedding blood will face the full force of justice and things like that. So how precarious is this situation? And I think, of course, we'll never know the truth, but there seems to be a lot of forces behind the scene where they view peace in Syria as hostile to their interest, as being they're enemies of peace in Syria, if I can
yes.
requote the Qatari foreign minister.
Yes, peace in Syria, unfortunately, does have powerful enemies. The exact details are unclear, but it appears to be a crisis that was produced on the one hand by efforts by the new regime to arrest and disarm members of the old regime, and armed attacks conducted by remnants of the old regime against those pursuing them. And then what appears to have happened is that a number of the security forces were killed, and subsequent to that, these new security forces erupted into an orgy of violence and massacred hundreds of people in Latakia and Tartus, of predominantly Alawite citizens, including Alawites who were known to be opponents of the Assad regime, because there's this view among opponents of the ousted regime that the Assad regime was somehow an Alawite regime, and the Alawites are therefore somehow collectively responsible for the Assad regime and its crimes against the Syrian people. The problem is that the sectarian balance in Syria is on a knife's edge. And unless the current leadership makes very concerted, determined, serious efforts to make clear to all Syrians that they are part of the new Syria, and that any who try to sabotage that are enemies of Syria and will be dealt with accordingly, we could very easily end up in a Lebanese style situation because, yes, the old regime has been ousted, but many of its forces remain within Syria and are capable of taking up arms again. The problem is that the new leadership in Syria appeared to be making all the right noises initially after it ousted the Assad regime on December 8th of last year. But its actions during the past week have done anything but inspire confidence, and one could argue have even been fanning the flames rather than dampening them down.
That wraps up our show for another week, Moin. Thank you. That was my guest, Moin Rabbani.
Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in, and see you next week for another review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Moin Rabbani. Bye bye.